I think in the spirit of talking security, because I think that's why you're here, what my panel proposes to do is to try and build a body of knowledge about how is it that we are going to de-risk resilience. And of course, the African continent, we always have very, very good practices. It's an opportunity for us to share some of these best practices and some of these lessons that have been learned. So as I wait for my team panels to join, I would ask Dr. Atan of ISPAC to join us. I'll also ask Alessandra to join us. I think she's just out there. She'll be joining us soon. Oh, she's here. Okay, thank you. I'll also be asking, CB is already here, and Abbas from the Bargo Foundation to join us. I'm not going to dictate their seating arrangement. But okay, it's okay. So I think to get moving, let me briefly explain what we hope to achieve in this panel. First, we want to share best practices and better understand the risks that we face around climate and security, try to accelerate solutions that are positive in nature to address conflict-sensitive challenges, and to integrate climate security risk analysis into the larger picture, because as we now understand, and as the Prime Cabinet Secretary and the other high-level panels have enumerated to us, that we can no longer escape from the problem of climate and security. So if you allow me, I'll take my seat, and we'll have a fruitful engagement to try and unpack this problem of climate and security. So maybe to get this discussion moving, perhaps I would like to pose the first question. And when I pose this first question, I'm going to literally ask each one of them to make general remarks about this question. But more largely, Dr. Guled Atan, who is the director of ISPAC, the Climate Prediction and Application Center, will take the first shot. And perhaps, Director, I'd like you to share with us, probably outlining one example of programming which we can say has had tangible core benefit on building climate resilience and peace within our region, and perhaps as a best practice that can be shared across the board. So, karibu, Dr. Guled Atan.
Thank you, Dr. Maybe maybe I can outline more than one, if you allow me. Thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers of this meeting for inviting us. First of all, let me actually give you an overview of IGAD itself. As the National Security Advisor she has mentioned, IGAD was created in 1986 exactly for this reason. IGAD, when it was created in 86, it had 2 Ds: drought and desertification. Then in 96, there was a revitalization process, and the double D became 1D with development. So we have been, from our inception as an organization, we have been dealing with actually the effects of climate change from day one. The IGAD region is about 70% made of ASAL, arid and semi-arid land, where for the most part pastoralism is a way of life, and people move from area where there is rain and area with pasture. And when they move to new area, there are people who are living there, and those create conflicts. In IGAD, we have been involved on the risking climate, especially peace building and climate in several ways, especially on policies, frameworks, institutions, and initiatives. On policies, we work with our member countries on harmonization of their policies. One actually policy that has been assigned by most countries in the region is the transhuman, basically the ability of moving livestock from one country to the other. We know that climate doesn't stop at the border, so we share more or less the same climate. And on institutions, we have IGAD has created several institutions. First of them is the IGAD Climate Prediction Application Center that I'm the director, where we predict climate from different time scales, from the week, monthly, seasonal, to the projections. And those are central on building resilience. And I might add, actually, the center is located here in Nairobi, and I would like actually to thank the Kenyan government for providing us the land and hosting us here in Nairobi. Another building block is the pastoral and arid land center, also that deals with all matters on livestock and pastoralism, also located here in Nairobi. We have another institution called CWARN, Conflict Early Warning Center, that's located in Addis. And what it does is that it monitors the potential of conflict arising, especially on conflict on resource-based conflicts. And it works on mediation and with the member countries. There are units within the member countries and how to solve those before they arise. Also, we have a flagship initiative called Idrisi. After the drought of 2010-2011, the head of states of IGAD plus the East African Community met here in Nairobi. And there was a declaration called the Nairobi Declaration to end droughts becoming disaster again. And that initiative has raised several $1 billion within the last 10 years. And is one of the reasons why the current drought that has ended with these rains, that was actually 5 seasons, no life was lost. Although it was the longest drought, the severest drought that this region has seen. So there is some resilience that has been built in the region, but it's not enough. If you look at the number of people who are in need of humanitarian aid in this region, the IPC 3 and above, from 2010 to now, it has been increasing every year. The last number that we have is around 51 million people. That's around 20% of the whole global population. Everywhere if you go. And this region has around 4% of the total population. So IGAD has been dealing in this, as I said, through knowledge generation and initiatives, policy harmonization, and so on. So I'll stop there.
Perhaps in trying to further stretch that discussion around the capabilities within the region, perhaps I'll ask again Alessandra, who is the manager of UNDP Resilience Hub for Africa, to also share some lessons regarding the capabilities and how we can build this climate resilience and peace from some of the best practices that you could share with some of us.
Thank you, and allow me to first thank the organizers for inviting UNDP to this important conference and to share some of the work that we do in the region. So the Resilience Hub for Africa covers the entire sub-Saharan Africa region, so it's 46 countries. Dr. Guled has focused on the Horn of Africa. I'd like to focus on the Sahel, where we have started to invest programmatically on climate security, and I want to share a few experiences very briefly. But first and foremost, we are investing quite heavily in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, with quite a sizable programmatic initiative on climate security. And here, in one of the earlier conversations, we were talking about the trade-off between investing in climate and in security. So no trade-off. Our approach addresses both the climate element, the climate-related risk, but also the security side. And our interventions focus very much on climate services and, of course, climate services to inform decision-making, data collection to inform decision-making, but also climate change adaptation, solutions for alternative sources of livelihood, access to water, food security, but also on the governance side is very important to strengthen governance institutions, particularly at the local level, and to work on social cohesion. So very large program that is starting to yield results, both on the climate side, climate change adaptation side, but also on the peace building and conflict prevention side in Mali, Burkina, and Niger. I also wanted to share that we are mainstreaming, and this is a different approach, mainstreaming climate security in our stabilization program, still in the Sahel. UNDP has invested quite heavily on stabilization in the Liptako-Gorma, I always stumble on this word, and the Lake Chad Basin. Stabilization programs, you know them very well, are large program to restore state authority, to build social cohesion. And in the context of those, we are mainstreaming climate security because stabilization programs actually are implemented in areas that are at climate-related security risk. How do we do that? So two important aspects in terms of mainstreaming. Number one, on the analysis. We are really trying to understand what is the impact of climate security on recruitment, particularly from Boko Haram. So what is the likelihood, or what is the impact of climate security in increasing the likelihood of recruitment by Boko Haram, particularly of the youth. On the programmatic side, the focus is on livelihood, because what is emerging from initial research and initial analysis is that access to livelihood, and therefore lack of thereof, that increases the likelihood of recruitment. So very much investing in diversifying and amplifying livelihood opportunity, particularly for the youth.
I think thinking about the question of resilience, even in our case, I think because Abbas Kassim, you largely involved in understanding and shaping the dialogue and discourse in Somalia, and perhaps based on the same concept, you could share with us some key examples from your work in Somalia and through the Bagop Foundation in terms of how is it that you are contributing to an understanding of this very critical problem.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Kimoli. And thank you for the opportunity to share our experience and lessons learned with this diverse audience. Bago Foundation is a peace-building organization, and we've been working in Somalia since 2015 on broader issues of peace-building. But we began working on or supporting climate security back in 2020 when the nexus between climate change and conflict became apparent in our regular analysis of conflict, because people often complain about scarce resources, mainly water, and so I must admit that we came quite late as most peace-building organizations, because most of us did not make that connection early enough, or has not been realized by most policymakers as well. So we started the work in Galmudug and Hirshabelle State of Somalia, mainly supporting and providing a platform for communities on conflict transformation, as well as awareness raising on the nexus between climate change and conflict. And we do this through we did this by establishing a network of individuals who are based within their communities and already active, and known as Inside the Peace Builders Network in both Hirshabelle and Galmudug. And these people are people who are already active within their communities and have the platform and access to do this kind of work at the community level. And we capacitated them by building, by developing their understanding of the nexus as well as the impact of climate change. We did this through a partnership with organizations like UNEP, because we are a peace-building organization, so we are not experts on climate change. And so we also build the capacity of government officials, particularly from relevant ministries, state-level ministries of environment and climate change, as well as ministries of reconciliation, in understanding the nexus as well. Because remember, most of these conversations used to take place at the upper echelon of policy making, but not at the community level. And it never used to trickle down at the community level. And this is what we're trying to do, and really capacitating people who are severely affected by the impact of climate change. Another important component is awareness raising through radio program, which is aired on monthly basis in both Hirshabelle and Galmudug states. And with this is, local experts are having discussions on live radio on the impact of climate change. And we strategically made it at 4 p.m. when, pastoralist communities are moving to their homes after spending the day in the towns. And there's a lot of discussions happening in the radio program. And with this, we're trying to, put the word out there on the connection between the climate change and conflict. Another important aspect is knowledge generation, which again, we all understand that climate change is context specific. The climate challenges faced by one district might be different from the challenges faced in another district. So what we're trying to do is we're developing a climate security action plan focusing on particular districts in Somalia, trying to really understand what are the unique challenges those particular districts are facing when it comes to climate change, when it comes to conflicts, when it comes to environmental degradation. And a good example is a project that we did in Beledweyne district. I must admit that there are a number of recommendations in that document which is beyond our scope as a peace-building organization, which calls for partnership between peace-building organizations and development organizations. For example, there's a need to create alternative livelihood for communities affected by the impact of climate change. This is not something we can do as a peace-building organization. There's a need for canal rehabilitation. There's a need for rehabilitation of water sources. And this calls for partnership with development organizations. And I must say that we've already begun establishing this partnership. We are starting a new project with IOM, funded by the Danish government, on natural resource management and conflict management in those particular areas. And lastly, I would like to mention an important component, which is sustained dialogue in conflict hotspots in both Hirshabelle and Galmudug states. And what this means is communities are given a platform to really have a dialogue and consultations regarding the natural resources that they have and how they can better manage them to avoid conflicts and prevent conflicts. Thank you.
I think both of you, the three of you have raised very interesting concepts around this issue and connection between climate and security. And perhaps CB, who is a senior regional advisor at the WF, perhaps as you also elaborate on some of these challenges, especially an example of the programming activities that you are undertaking, perhaps you could also touch on the fact that climate change is also inducing a lot of hunger problems and largely affecting our region. But also, what are some of the structural challenges that you face in your area, and how can we then help to translate some of this knowledge into policy documents that can help to drive change in the way we address the question of climate change and security?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning. It's a pleasure to be at the Berlin Climate Security Conference again, see lots of familiar faces, and hear where the dialogue is evolving and perhaps where we need to push it along a little bit. I really enjoyed the opening remarks this morning, such a distinguished group of speakers. And, you know, Ms. Tete mentioned that the climate crisis is here already. And I think coming from the perspective, mostly we work at the community level in WFP in very remote contexts, very fragile contexts, and I concur with that already. Not to be controversial, but I also concur with what she said about mitigation efforts largely having failed. If we are to measure their success by the difference that they've made on the ground, I think the results or the lack of results speak for themselves. We are absolutely in an era of loss and damage, and here to talk about practical ways of addressing that. And one of the effects of being in the era of loss and damage is an increase in conflict. So WFP, that's the World Food Program, is the frontline agency. Mostly you know us responding to crises, humanitarian response. And indeed, 80% of our work is in a conflict-affected context. So we're familiar with conflict, but we've seen for a long time just what you mentioned, that the climate crisis is driving hunger, is driving malnutrition, and the needs are by far exceeding any kind of humanitarian response that's ongoing at the moment or that could possibly be mounted. So we have been working on what we're now calling climate security for a very long time, comparatively, and in fact worked with Adelphi in 2020 on doing 3 very in-depth analyses in very different countries, so Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda. And what we found there is indeed that these issues that are linked to climate, water scarcity has come up a lot, livelihoods have come up a lot. We're indeed contributing to conflict, and these reports also helped us identify some of the pathways that could mitigate, some of the activities that could mitigate these effects, and that's what I'm up here to talk to you about today. Of course, we're not the only one working on these activities, and I wanted just to recognize IGPALD. This is another excellent department of IGAD that has been considering these issues for a long time. Ato Daraja is there in the audience. If you'll just give us a wave, and if you ask them, they will tell you where the investments need to be made to support the livelihoods of groups like pastoralists and other small producers that are really put in jeopardy by these climate shocks. I'd like to make a call before I go into some concrete examples for scale. You know, what we've seen for many, many years is small approaches, small investments, country-specific, in one community, and these are very important because we need to know what works. There is a shortage of the evidence about what works in one area may not work for another. A lot of the challenges with water cut across borders, cut across policy frameworks, and as was mentioned here, A lot of the time, the people who are affected most directly by these issues are not adequately represented, their voices are not heard, particularly when we're talking about precious resources like water. We have to be mindful of issues like equity, we have to be mindful of the governance of those issues, and the groups that are going to be particularly impacted, disproportionately impacted. Those could be women, those could be people living with disabilities, those could be people marginalized for other reasons, politically or by their citizenship, say refugees. So that's just what I wanted to say as a backdrop, and maybe as specific examples. You know, you've mentioned the second part of your question was about how have you had to cut across sectors or work in different ways. And the first example that I wanted to give was about pastoralists. You know, the title of this panel was about de-risking, and we heard a lot this morning about how we must de-risk investments for the private sector and how government can de-risk these investments. There's not a lot of talk about who is working on these de-risking, on this de-risking for pastoralists. Being a pastoralist right now is an extremely risky livelihood. It also happens to be one of the most appropriate productive livelihoods for arid and semi-arid areas. When pastoralists drop out, when that livelihood doesn't work due to drought, displacement, other regions, those people tend to become WFP clients. They tend to become extremely reliant on government safety nets. So they have been a group of special interest for WFP, for IGAD, for others for some time. So one programming response, and in fact this was a result, a recommendation from the Adelphi WFP reports, invest in the pastoral livelihood chain, invest in the livelihoods of people who would otherwise be forced to move or be entirely reliant on public support. So we looked at how we might de-risk these livelihoods, and there are a number of ways to do it. One I would like to highlight here is small-scale insurance, micro-insurance, that is weather indexed. In this case, it's indexed to the pasture condition, and when that pasture condition falls below certain levels, a payout can be triggered. And of course, I've oversimplified that enormously. There are many ins and outs to it, but at least there's a way where we can support pastoralists with risk financing, the same way that you get insurance when you drive a car, the same way there is insurance available for commercial farmers. What's a model that might make this available for pastoralists, for small groups? You know, we're talking of people who don't own that many head of cattle, the more vulnerable but viable pastoralists. That's something that we've been able to do at scale. It's been picked up by the bank, it's been picked up by COMESA, it's been picked up by other entities. It should go to scale, but it's not an easy program to run. When we do that, we find that the money from that payout, it goes to veterinary services, it goes to transport of the animal, it goes to buying fodder, it goes to buying water. So that's something that we also, when there are gaps in that, we've also supported entities to make that veterinary care available along migratory routes. If you talk to Dr. Dereje, he will tell you that one of the problems is that water points are being established, but they're not being established along traditional migratory routes. And that's because the people say, well, we're going to put a borehole here. There's no one living in this area, so we're not going to put a water source there. Well, that happens to be a traditional migratory route. And if we listen to the affected community or the local government experts, as Ms. Tete said, government experts, regional experts know a lot about these contexts, and we should let them lead, direct where the programming investments should be made. Maybe I will leave it there, but just to say that similar to what's going on in the Sahel, there's also been successful examples of integrated programming. The way that we've worked in the past, where we are in silos and very specialized, and dare I say, quite territorial about our areas of expertise, that's no longer going to cut it. If we are to get to scale, we have to break through those silos, and we need the financing that was spoken about. We need it now, and we need it to fund the priorities that have already been established and the activities that are proven to work. Thank you.
I think in terms of the question of de-risking, I think I'd like to ask Alessandra, particularly with UNDP, because one of the measures that many countries in the Sahel and also in the Horn of Africa are undertaking is emergency response. And many times this type of emergency response reallocates scarce resources from development to emergency response, in the long run undermining state capacity to plan for tomorrow. So in the case of the Sahel, what suggestions do you have in terms of building the capacity of states, even as they confront the de-risking and mitigation of climate change and facing the financial crisis and debt problems that they are facing, so that they can still provide the necessary framework that will help to build resilience, to take care of mitigation, but also to meet all the other development priorities that are required in view of our SDGs, Africa 2063 agenda. Because at the end of the day, as much as we want to speak about climate change and security, if we don't meet the basic needs of our people, it will be very hard for them to appreciate the link between climate change and their daily non-survival.
Thanks, a very pertinent question, and I want to actually start by what my colleague from WFP just said earlier. Humanitarian needs exceeds demand. I actually wrote it because it's very, very true. We live in a world where, you know, in a polycrisis. This morning in one of the earlier panel, we heard the word polycrisis. And the capacity of the humanitarian system to respond to this many crises is actually about to collapse. And this is because there has been for the longest time a very much, and this is a challenge, there has been an emphasis on looking at the symptoms rather than addressing the root cause. Because, you know, if we continue addressing the symptoms, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a wound that has deep-rooted sort of causes that are far below, you know, the area that you are curing or curating. I'm saying this, and actually was the special envoy for Kenya, the climate envoy for Kenya this morning that said that we are talking about a development issue. So when I think about climate change, I always ask myself a question. Why is it climate change actually doesn't know boundaries, right? Is affecting everyone from north to south, east to west. And my question is, why is it in countries, in OECD countries, for example, we are not talking about climate security? Why is it that it's not even spoken? Why is it that it is a problem only of fragile states and developing countries, particularly in this continent? Because of underlying drivers of vulnerabilities which we have never addressed, because of deep-rooted inequalities that we have never addressed, because of poverty, lack of access to services, education, water, sanitation. So these are the kind of investments that we need to do today to be able to reduce that dependency and that need on humanitarian support that my colleague was actually referring to and was saying, you know, we are at a breaking point and we can't continue along this pace.
I think essentially there seems to be a convergence around unpacking some of the challenges that all of you are facing in your various stations. And I remember when the Prime Cabinet Secretary was reading his remarks, he talked about the challenge of climate change appearing or converging with fragility. And in view of that, I think I would appreciate to hear some input from Dr. Aton in terms of what ISPAC is doing around and what are some of the structural challenges that you are facing. And in terms of the wealth of knowledge and data and information that you have, how can that be processed and packaged so that it can help to contribute to a better understanding among the member states, but also relief agencies and other international organizations that are dealing with this on a daily basis?
Thank you very much. Let me start first. I actually concur with Alessandra. The problem is actually development. So if you see droughts are happening everywhere. If I remember well, California was under a multi-year drought few years ago. It ended up this last winter. But the only problem that has happened was that people couldn't water their lawns. That's it. So the problem actually, the root problem is development, and is a problem that needs a solution, long-term solutions. And in my opinion, the best solution is education. It's working on the education of, and maybe most probably, somebody was saying that pastoralism is a very best way of, but maybe it might not be for too long with the recurrent droughts and floods. On coming on the data, we have several mechanisms where we share data, and we work actually hands in glove with our member countries. On early warning, actually, we're really good. Where we're lacking is early actions. It's tying up that early warning. We have a good knowledge of at least seasonally, from a season point. We have a good grasp. Our abilities are around 85% of the time we are right. But the problem is at the early action. It's tying up those two policies and early actions on our early warning. Also, another problem we have in this region is that met data. If you look at met data from the 70s to now, it's becoming actually less instead of increasing. And if that data is not recorded, basically meteorological data, if that data is not recorded and shared, it is lost forever. You cannot recover. Now what we are doing is that we are augmenting. We receive around 200 stations from the member countries. We're augmenting that data with satellite data, model outputs, and so on. So data is a must. So because if we don't have the capacity of monitoring, forecasting, and projecting climate conditions, we'll never have the capacity of building resilience. Those are interlinked. But also, I would like to mention one thing that I forgot in my previous one. At IGAD, we created a mechanism, climate security mechanism, coordination mechanism, that has been endorsed by the summit that has just ended in Djibouti a few weeks ago. And we're working with the UN Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa and the African Union. And we're the first REC in Africa that has established that mechanism.
I think I'll move the same question to CB. Although you have captured a lot of the issues in your previous presentation, I think I'd like to hear a little bit more in view of the fact that you work with very fragile communities, and then perhaps again ask Abbas to comment on the same. Maybe each one of you can take 2 minutes, because what I would also like to do is to open up to the audience and just get their reaction, and maybe we can have 1 or 2 people share some of their stories. Because one thing I've come to find out in climate change is that storytelling at times, or sharing stories or experiences, helps us, because at times we are confronted with a problem that we may not be aware how to resolve it, but by listening to what someone else is doing, we tend to find that knowledge. And in that process, we can share that knowledge with others. So maybe the two of you can each take 2 minutes, and then we'll open up to two individuals from the audience, and also see how is it then that we can further enrich this conversation.
Thank you very much. So I would say on structural challenges, as Alessandra said, you know, if you've talked to a humanitarian recently, you will find a very agitated, concerned, anxious person. I think the humanitarian world is absolutely in SOS mode, and funding reductions are upon us again. And, you know, that one, I think it's going to affect all of us. I usually use the metaphor, it's like pouring water into a bucket with a hole in it. You know, it doesn't matter how much you pour or how fast you pour, that's not going to get us where we go. I want to be a bit provocative and ask, you know, the audience whether these categories of development, humanitarian, peace, but do they apply in the way that they did before? Are they as helpful as they were before? You know, and climate gives us that good example. Is it a development underinvestment? Is it a natural shock that's created a humanitarian catastrophe? Or is it something entirely different? Of course, those categories exist for a reason. There must be order, and in a government, you know, humanitarian crises are dealt with by a certain department, and development is dealt with by a certain ministry. We understand that. The money that comes is also different. So money for a humanitarian crisis will be very high, but it will be very restricted, and it will be for use for 1 year. What can you do with a lot of money, but for a very short time? So those boundaries, these structures are not as helpful as they were, and certainly WFP, but also others as a true nexus actor. We are there, we've been in communities often till the 60s, but we're on the front lines during a humanitarian crisis, and as the Nobel Peace Prize showed, there is a role in peace building for that. So what should we do? I think we have to help this system to evolve. It's a very difficult thing to do. We can still use humanitarian money and the bulk that it has in ways that are helpful to address development issues. You can have, I mean, if there are any donors in this house, I would appeal to you on behalf of myself and any other actor in this space. What we need is multi-year money that is flexible. You have to trust your experts to know where that money needs to be allocated. Nowhere is that more true than in climate security. The big money is with the security actors. The climate money is going somewhere else. It is not coming to the global south. Let me tell you again. If you look at the percentage of those climate funds that were intended to address loss and damage, they're in Germany, they're in Denmark, they're in the US, they're not in the Horn, they're not in the Sahel, they are not in Somalia, they are not in Ethiopia. And that's because it's very difficult to get that money. Well, we need to work harder to do it. They have to meet us halfway, otherwise what is the point of having those funds? So that would be it, and perhaps with my 30 seconds, I would say, if you were to ask me one investment that we can all make that will pay dividends in the developmental sphere for the peace builders, for the climate actors, it's attention to water scarcity. And that is a very tricky one. As was mentioned, it's not just a global south problem. California and Arizona were arguing just like Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia. It's not just a global south problem, but there is financing in the north to address those issues, to make them just about watering your lawn. Here it can become a war, an intrastate conflict, or indeed a larger conflict, because we don't have the financing to do what needs to be done. We know what needs to be done, we don't have the financing or the fiscal space to do what needs to be done. Maybe I'll leave it there.
I think I'll ask you the same, maybe take a minute, because I think it would be also good to hear from the audience. I'm sure there must be one or two who would like to make some contribution.
Yeah, mine will be very short. I think the biggest structural challenge that we have working in this field is that development organizations, be they UN agencies or other NGOs and peace-building organizations, are working on the same topic, but in silos. So there's no proper coordination mechanism to kind of, you know, learn from each other's work and jointly identify what are the needs and in what location, and how discussion on how they can possibly work together. I think without that, as you said, we wouldn't be doing anything. And my message also to the donors will be, let's use the ongoing projects. Now we have an environmental peace building project with Adelphi, and we can use these kind of projects to learn from them, from the knowledge that you're producing, to scale it up. and have a long-term, engagement in reaching those communities. Thank you.
I think I had another question that I would have asked all of them, but maybe I'll propose that they can answer this question when they are during coffee, because I would be interested to know, in your area of work, what has really surprised you, or when you engage with policy actors and policy makers. Are they surprised by the type of data that you provide, or the type of knowledge that you provide, or the type of problems that you enumerate in terms of the challenges of climate change? At this stage, I think I would like to ask any volunteers. I think I see, maybe I'll start with Mr. Isife Burima. I think he's the Executive Secretary of the Sahel Region Climate Commission, and he could join us, maybe take like 4 minutes to share with us some of his experiences, and then we'll have an opportunity for, I think, one more from the audience, because I don't think I'll be able to take more than that. Okay, so I think you can go ahead and just share with us, because I think the Sahel is one region that has been really hit hard by climate change and linkages to national security.
Thank you, Chair. I'm so sorry, I'm French speaking, and so that I've prepared my remark, and so I invite the assistant to listen to me. I'll read it. Okay. First, ladies and gentlemen, to your titles and your ranks, I would like first of all, at the beginning of my remarks, to congratulate Adelphi and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany and Kenya for the initiative of organizing the important conference which brings us together today in Nairobi. I would also like to sincerely thank Adelphi to the invitation addressed to the Sahel Commission, as well as the government of Kenya for its legendary hospitality. Karibu. I would like also to thank our distinguished panelists for their important contribution. The theme of this panel, for which our contribution has been requested, is of capital interest in the sense that it perfectly summarizes the challenge and the issues expected to be discussed during this conference. Allow us to take the opportunity offered by the animation of the said panel for a brief introduction to the Climate Commission for the Sahel region, of which we have the honor to assume the responsibility as Executive Secretary. Indeed, this commission is an intergovernmental institution created under the aegis of the African Union, whose mandate is to promote and coordinate the implementation of climate resilience action and politics for the benefit of 17 member countries of the Sahel Straits, extending from Atlantic Sea, Cape Verde, to India Sea, Djibouti. This is the place to note the perfect adequacy of the term of the side panel with the scope of action of the Commission, and the driving politics adapted to achieve the resilience of population and their livelihood in the face of climate and security shocks, throughout the promotion and capitalization of good practices is major interest for a region like the Sahel, tested by various forms of challenge, including environmental, social, political, economic, and security. The importance of scope of the theme of this panel should lead us to a series of findings and state of affairs, ending it should be emphasized that despite the effort of our government and with the support of many partners, the persistence of this challenge, particularly those relating to the climate problem and the security shock, which are also characterized furthermore on the life of communities and their livelihoods. Faced with this situation, it's important to highlight the existence of a series of factors that limit the effectiveness of intervention in the face of these phenomena. Mainly, we could mention the weak technical capacity of the actors within the framework on the definition and the implementation of the structuring and the coherent actions, the poor knowledge and reliable data on the scope of the impact of these phenomena as well as good practice, particularly in case of integrated action in response to climate-based security nexus and other shocks. The weak synergy of the actors within the framework on the financing and the implementation of these actions, the lack of adequate funding given the scale of this challenge. It is thus obvious the need to take these factors mentioned above into account in the context of a new impetus of political in the context of the fight against climate problem and shocks in the Sahel in particular and in Africa in general. Drawing on these lessons and in accordance with its mandate, the Commission intends to focus on carrying out a series of studies that should lead to the development of structuring program in terms of climate and security in the Sahel. Among these studies, I particularly note a characterization study of fragile area in the Sahel to help map the typology and the scale of fragility. A study on the perception of vulnerable communities on the effectiveness of resilience action in the Sahel. These two studies should thus make it possible to develop a coherent structuring pilot program, making it possible to contribute the providence, sustained and adapted response to the effect of the climate and security nexus basis in the case of good practice. In the dynamic, the Sahel Climate Commission hopes to benefit from the support of others and other partners or potential partners as UNDP for the realization of its priority action. With regard to the factor relating to the low mobilization of resources to finance climate initiatives and policy, particularly in the Sahel, it is worth highlighting the unfavorable context characterized by the persistence of post-COVID effects, as well as those linking to the war in Ukraine and the level of the international economic environment. Unfortunately, this has the consequence of diverting attention and priority from development action to the benefit of our countries, which has been greatly affected by the effect of environmental and social political phenomena. In the dynamic of providing solution to this situation of low resource mobilization, the Sahel Commission has thus endowed the Sahel region with the Sahel Climate Fund. This fund, new fund, should contribute to the alignment of funding for the resilience action by mobilizing resources from member states, bilateral and multilateral partners, philanthropic funds, decentralized local authorities, and as well as private financial institutions. The main operational objective of this fund whose intervention mechanisms are considered innovative and appropriated are raised to $2 billion US, 19% of which from national, regional, and international donors, and 10% from the member states of the Commission. Implement high impact in mitigation and adaptation projects. Create a virtuous cycle of financing and feed itself through an effective combination of profitability and positive environmental and social impact. Strengthen the technical capacity of member states in the mobilization and the structuring of climate finance. Also, confessing of the weak capacity of the Sahel stakeholders in the development of structuring projects, the Executive Secretary of the Commission has included in its roadmap capacity building action for regional and national actors, as well as meeting and forum for sharing best practice and strengthening synergy. Thus, in the dynamic of the agenda major thematic meeting planned by the Sahel Commission, I have the pleasure to seizing this opportunity to invite Adelphi to examine, in conjunction with its other partners, the organization of a regional conference focused in the climate security nexus in the Sahel. The theme of this conference could be oriented toward innovative mechanisms for financing and capitalizing on good practice of resilience action in fragile area. Thank you for your kind attention. I'm so sorry, Chair.
That's fine, that's fine.
I'm French speaker.
That's fine.
We have many capital experience with Chair. Ask the assistance. So let's talk about establish can confirm that the good job which UNDP in Niger and Burkina and Mali. That is very important. When we take an example for the action on establishing in the area of Lac Chad, an example for best practice which can be we can have opportunity to implementation in a big scale way. It's for that, for me, for us, we have in Sahel many initiatives. Doctor, you know that. But the challenge is the coherence and the synergy of actors. It's very important to note this. We have many initiatives. Many initiatives, but if you go to do the following in operational way, the communities can say that many action they didn't give you the effects of the action. It's for that we have the responsibility to look together how to improve the efficiency of our action. This is the responsibility for the countries, communities, and donors. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we intentionally wanted to listen to him because the Sahel is one very fragile region, and it provides us very deep lessons because although we did not address that issue, we are all aware that fragility breeds insecurity. It provides a breeding ground for terrorist organizations, for banditry, for transnational organized crime. And we can clearly see that within the Sahel, remembering the United Nations as a Security Council has itself seized of the Sahel as one area that is a case study of climate and security. Perhaps because of the essence of time, before we disembark from the stage, I'll just take just one, and please only take a minute. I wouldn't want to cut you off, but just 30 seconds of something that you think we have not said that we must say. So please don't say what you have already said. Say something that we haven't said on this stage.
Thank you very much. My name is Wairimu Kanyere from Groots Kenya. Groots is an organization that works with grassroots women. And we work in 4 thematic areas. One is community resilience to disasters and climate change, women and property, women and leadership, and health. From morning, we have had good presenters with very informative information. And my concern is, and thank you, CB, because you work closely with the communities. You touched about women and the PWDs, and you didn't mention about girls. We don't leave girls behind. And my concern is, you talked about risk financing to pastoralists who don't have a huge number of cattle or camels, but I have not had any presenter this morning speaking of crop agriculture farmers, which is also a threat to climate and security because of food security. Thank you.
I think I wanted to hear from the crisis group. If there's anybody from the crisis group, they are usually telling us, they are usually having us these warnings to all of us. Be prepared, this is coming. And at times, many policymakers, we don't react, and then it happens. So if there's a crisis group.
Yes, hi. Nazanin Mashiri here, Senior Analyst for International Crisis Group working on climate, conflict and environment in Africa. I've heard it said today that climate change is a threat multiplier. I don't think we'd like to use that term anymore. I think it's predominantly a risk issue. And we'd like to say it's a risk multiplier instead. And what's important and what needs to be emphasized today is that mediation, and we've heard a lot about mediation at a local level, needs to be backed up by climate adaptation, which is conflict sensitive. I mean, there is an appetite for conflict resolution amongst young people and women, people who are not committed to age-old grievances that we see. And there is a conflict fatigue in the region, and we need to kind of tap into that as well. Also, we don't have conflict-sensitive policies or multilateral mechanisms for financing. They are not fit for purpose, and we have to admit that, and we have to deal with that. Also, we see climate links to security contested at the United Nations Security Council, sidelined at COP, and we need to consider these issues, and we need to push for these issues. One thing that surprised me, which is very interesting, and I heard this recently because we're working at Crisis Group on Northern Cameroon as well, just to give you an example, is that as well as considering the security aspects and the hydrological aspects of where we put these water adaptation points and these water points, we need to consider the cultural aspects too. In northern Cameroon, boreholes have been constructed in villages that families don't use. Families don't use these boreholes because for years they send their children to rivers to collect water. So these boreholes that we spent a lot of money on are not being used because development agencies are not consulting local communities. So we really need to consult local communities. Another thing that we haven't spoken about is armed groups and the influence of non-state armed actors in the region, particularly in Somalia, Al-Shabaab, for example. Now we're looking at the military offensive in Somalia. Let's look at the vacuums that are left behind when we take over these areas and retake these regions. Al-Shabaab, despite bringing terror to many people in many regions, they actually involve themselves in mediation. They prevent the construction of water points which are too close to towns. So we need to consider these, and we need to coordinate, and we need to focus on these issues when we're thinking about de-risking. Thank you.
I think I have maybe 5 more minutes. One of the great challenges we face with climate change is the problem of hunger. And I don't want my session to come before your lunch. I would ask if there is, I think there's a UNOWAS, and then after that I'll only take one more from the audience. I didn't know that this risking would be of very big interest to all of us, but I'm happy that at least we have tried to give it enough flesh.
Good morning, everyone. I am very cold, so if you see me putting my hand in my pocket, it's because I come from West Africa. I want to repeat what the sister said about from the crisis group. It's exactly what I wanted to say, but in the West Africa and Sahel. My name is Galine Yanon, Climate Security Advisor for United Nations Office for West Africa and Sahel. The past 2 months, I spent all the time in the Liptako Nguruma country and also the Lake Chad Basin, looking at trying to understand and to interact more with people. So allow me today to be the voice of those people that I was discussing with them. So we've been talking about climate change adaptation, mitigation. These are not new. We know them. So since how many generations we've been talking about the same thing. But one thing, if I have to start by responding to your last question, what have surprising us, we are not listening. I think it's time for us to start listening to the voice of people, to start listening to what they want exactly. So I was discussing with this group of displaced people in Difa. Difa is in Niger. So what they said is that we are tired about humanitarian action. Why they are saying that is that because it's been 10 years they are in that camp and they are just being assisted. So when are they going to come out of that situation and go back to the villages? So this is very important for us to consider. And there are children who was born there and they only know assistance. So how do we want to raise people in the future, or independent people, if we don't train them in terms of development, in terms of taking care of themselves? I think it's one thing that we need to consider when working in this area. Also, one group of people that are missing also in the site is the defense and security and defense force that we work with them. So they are not in the room, but I was discussing with the general commander in charge of the joint force in Maiduguri this time. So what he said that we have done our part of the job, so we need now development. So if you go to that area, you see that there are many people who are displaced, whether by drought or flooding. So flooding issues are very recurrent. So what are we doing for them? So they are here, they don't have access to land for farming, they don't have access to any resource of water. What are we doing for that? So we are leaving people, we are assisting them, but at the end of the day, they have become more vulnerable and being recruited by the armed group again. So I want to end now by encouraging us to be more collaborative, more working together. Because in DIFA, for example, so what I observe is that in just one small community, you have more than 200 international organizations working there. So you will tell me that now we have funding issue, but all of them are having projects in those areas. So what about if we come together to achieve the same goal? I think that we need to also look at the resource that we have, the resource that government have, instead of waiting for resource that come from abroad. Thank you very much.
I think in my last 2 minutes, because you've raised a very interesting concept around defense cooperation, and you actually asked if you say that there may not be any military people in the room, and I'm aware that we have 2 military generals, current serving generals. I would like to ask one of them, probably the commandant of the National Defense College, because the National Defense College is our premier college that teaches us strategy and confronts most of these problems. So I would request Major General Elmi, or probably Major General Waliaula, who has also been involved in a lot of climate mitigation measures, to just, in 2 minutes, highlight the dimension of defense in terms of de-risking the question of climate change. And then after that, we'll be honored to go for our lunch. Please bear, let's hear what he's going to tell us.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Sagala. My name is Major General Rashid Elmi. I am the current commandant of the National Defense College, Kenya, college of the National Defense University, where we train strategic leaders in national policy. We have a course of about 70 people now from 15 different countries. And this is a very interesting subject that we attend today, because the military and the security agencies are at the center of this discussion. I want to correct my brother that we are here and we are seriously in this conversation. Dr. Sagala actually teaches at my college. And some of the things we do is to ask the hard questions about what is the evolution of climate change, how has it affected people, and where are we heading to? What we do is reflect on some of the things we have done in our jobs. I have served in Iraq, in the marshes of southern Iraq, and some of the lessons that we have learned is that climate change, whether it's human-induced or naturally happening, has serious effect on security. Today, southern Iraq is basically dry. When I was there in 1995 and 96 as UN military observer, the livelihood of that part of the world was supporting nearly half the population of Iraq. And so we have 2 advantages. We have seen things happen on the ground, and we are teaching people the effects of some of those things that we know. So I want to advise the people in the room that there's a lot that you can get from people who have done it and seen it. There's a group of people called military observers. They have been all over the world. They have seen the crises that happen. They have seen what goes on and what effect security challenges have on human security. And therefore, I'll advise, please invite us to your meetings. We will be able to share 1 or 2 things. And that is exactly the education we are passing to people from the region and from all over the world. We have people from Nepal, the farthest country I have now in Kenya, and India, and 15 other, or rather 13 other African countries that we are basically discussing security, and climate change and the effects of climate change is a very big portion of that discussion. Thank you.
I think on behalf of the team on the stage, I would say we needed more time, but we don't want to get into your lunch. I think I would request that we give them a round of applause. I think it was, usually I'm told when you have, I'm told when you run out of time, it means you've done a good job. I think you guys have done a wonderful job, and I think I'll hand it over to the MC. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot from you, and I think during lunch and during coffee, we'll continue to spread this conversation. Thank you.